Webinar, documenting the pandemic through digital records. If you care to, you are welcome to enter your name and location in the chat. We can see folks joining us from all over the place. And as a reminder, please make sure your microphone is muted during the presentation. Oh, there we go. Welcome, everyone. I'm Jamie Patrick Burns. I'm the Digital Archivist at the State Archives of North Carolina, and I will be moderating the webinar today. I've got just a few announcements before we dive in and get started. We've got some more webinars lined up for this spring. In March is Follow the Yellow Brick Road, Decision Making for Storage of Electronic Records. Some folks from Multnomah County in Oregon will share about their journey of standardizing storage recommendations for different types of electronic records while embracing agency-specific business processes. And in April, we have Taking Action Before It's Too Late, Monitoring File Formats for Risk. And that will be by Adrienne Hansen from the University of Georgia, talking about research and workflows that she has done for monitoring file formats in their preservation system. There will be more coming in the months ahead too, so please do stay tuned. We've got these webinars every month. And I would just like to call your attention to the Resource Center as well on the COSA webpage. There's a great wealth of templates and example documents and tools and workflows. It's just a really good resource for all kinds of electronic records, digital preservation questions. I also encourage you to head on over to the YouTube channel. There are several topical videos that we add to regularly, such as capturing email, managing protected records. There's a video on bit rot, as well as past webinars. So again, if there's any particular topics or past webinars that you missed, you are welcome to go see those on YouTube as well. We encourage folks in the COSA community to keep an eye out for conferences and calls for proposals and representing state and territorial archives. The latest one would be the NAGARA Online Winter Forum, Information Governance, which is coming up later this month on the 25th. And finally, just a call out that SERI is recruiting for new members. So if you have found our offerings useful or looking for a way to network, get to know some more folks, and kind of give back professionally, there are subcommittees on education and programming, advocacy and outreach, and tools and resources. So we are more than happy to welcome more folks in. Just a note from Preservica is a sponsor for these webinars, and we are grateful for their support for this and ongoing education. So getting on to the good stuff, here are today's presenters, and just a quick bio and introduction for them, and then I will hand it over to the folks you are here to see. So Colin Reeve has been the Appraisal Archivist for the Government Records section of the North Carolina State Archives since April 2019, and previously worked in Special Collections and University Archives at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. Since the start of the COVID-19 state of emergency, he has been actively involved in the Archives COVID-19 Oral History Program. John Horan is the oral historian for the Special Collections section at the State Archives of North Carolina. Bonnie Weddle has worked for the New York State Archives for more than 20 years and has worked with electronic records since 2004. She currently leads the archive's accessioning of electronic records and capture of state government websites, and she is also a member of the archive's reference rotation. In addition, she is the co-chair of the State Electronic Records Initiative's Education and Programming Subcommittee. Jennifer O'Neill has worked for the New York State Archives for over 20 years as well, and currently supervises the Schooling and State Agency Services Unit. As such, she develops and reviews state agency and local government records retention schedules, coordinates the archival appraisal process, develops and presents workshops, and advises state agencies and local governments on a variety of records and records management topics. And last but not least, Derek Clark is the manager of the Electronic Records Branch for the Kentucky Department of Libraries and Archives. Very briefly, before I hand it over, just a note that we will hold questions until the end. And you are welcome to enter questions into the chat at any point in time. And then at the end, we'll do questions. You can unmute yourself and speak your question or put it into the chat and I'll read it. So without further ado, I will stop sharing and hand it over to Colin and John.
Thank you. I think we can go on to the next one, John, already. Good afternoon. As Jamie just said, I work within the government records section of the State Archives in North Carolina. And our primary mission really is to provide and administer record management services for state government agencies, local government agencies, and state-supported institutions of higher education within North Carolina, all in accordance with state statutes and the mandates provided within the laws for the preservation of the historical records of the state. What the section seldom does is to proactively create new records, except for those created in the normal course of business. But very early on in the COVID-19 state of emergency, it was recognized that because of the unprecedented nature of the pandemic and because of our mandate to preserve the historic record of the state, there was a necessity to provide a contemporaneous record of personal experiences of North Carolina state employees so that future researchers could understand what the employees underwent during the COVID pandemic. This was seen as being akin to the way researchers now use records from the 1918 influenza pandemic, and that these personal records would complement the other public records created during the pandemic. We also recognized fairly early on that oral histories were the best way to obtain these personal records. And so government records began to work with the Archive's Special Collections section, and specifically with the oral historian, to plan how this could be done. Can I have the next slide, please, John? Now, except for key workers, on March 17th, 2020, all North Carolina state agency workers were told to work remotely and offices were closed. But in April, when we began to plan sort of this oral history project, we thought towards the end of 2020, things will get back to normal, people will be back in the office and we can go off and interview them. And we could use this time between April and normality to give us time to identify potential interviewees and to give those interviewees a period of reflection before they talk to us. Of course, the reality turned out to be very different. And by the summer of 2020, we realized that not only was the pandemic not going to be over very soon, but in-person interviews were not going to be practicable. And we needed to think about whether we could do these interviews remotely. And also in the summer of 2020, the oral historian left the archives, and inevitably there was this several-month gap before a new oral historian was in post. And although at the time it was frustrating, in hindsight, this hiatus did have benefits, because by the time we actually started interviewing people in March 2020, the interviewees had been living and working with COVID for a year. So although the initial days and weeks of the pandemic were still relatively fresh in their minds, they'd had this whole 12 months of living within a pandemic, which they could draw on when they did the interviews. Cut the next slide, John, please. Now, from the off, we were clear that these recordings were going to be public records listed in the archives catalogue and made available to anyone. So the first challenge was to find a means to obtain high quality recordings when the interviewees would likely be at home or in their offices using a laptop without any specialized recording equipment. John will talk more about this in a bit, but we settled on Riverside FM podcasting software and decided we would only record audio. And we also recognize that COVID is a traumatic subject and it has impacted many people personally. So although the focus was on how the pandemic had impacted people's work lives, these days the boundaries between work and personal life has got very blurred, and the interviews were always likely to encroach onto the personal. But because the recordings are public records, we left it up to the interviewees about how much they wanted to talk about their personal lives. And again, John will talk about this in a moment. Before I hand over to John, just to wrap up this part with some statistics, we've so far focused on state agency employees. We've interviewed 36 people from across 11 agencies. We've also interviewed 2 county register of deeds, and we hope to interview more local government employees and people from the state university system. And with that, I'll hand over to John to talk about the content of the interviews.
All right, thanks, Colin. I will say it's actually 12 state agencies. The one that's missing on that list is the Department of Public Instruction. But other than that, there were certainly challenges that arose in the construction and implementation of this project. The first was how to do this project remotely. You know, oral history, like so many things, is done in person, face-to-face, one narrator, one interviewer, maybe an individual running support. It's always been my experience. Of course, I've conducted the odd oral history where there's a family in a room talking about their parents, or an oral history where, due to physical limitations, travel was impossible. So the interview happened on the phone. But never have I done the whole history project, oral history project, remotely. It's isolated from individuals I was talking to. On the contrary, I usually go into people's homes if they can't come to my studio. And with this project, I would again be going into people's homes, but this time through the magic of the internet. With that in mind, I had to research and determine the best way of gaining archival quality interviews remotely. I wanted the fidelity and ease of the physical recorder, but done virtually. After looking at several options, we settled on using the podcasting software, Riverside.fm, to maximize ease of use while also capturing that lossless file that we were looking for. You know, this is a technology that's available to podcasters who interview people for their shows across country. You can't come to the studio? Great, here's my link. And, you know, I also wanted to minimize the amount of work the narrator needed to do on their end. And in a physical recording situation, somebody sits down in front of the microphone, I hit play or I hit record, and off we go. I wanted the virtual experience to reflect that as much as possible. I didn't want them downloading any software or having to jump through any hoops. And utilizing this podcasting software, I'm happy to say we found a great compromise. The recordings are done locally, progressively uploaded throughout the interview, and it's to safeguard in case the call were to drop. And I'm happy to report that across the 36 interviews for this project and many more besides for other projects, besides a few technical glitches, no interviews have been lost for any of them. So that's great. As for the content of the interviews, we've had a wide range of perspectives, and a few of the themes I'll share with you today represent just a small fraction of what these individuals shared, but I think it's really quite fascinating. Since this project was mostly a self-selection project, and the individuals had a keen sense of the stories and willingness to share. For example, in the Department of Labor, Chief of Staff Art Britt, an amateur historian, saw the need to preserve the memory of this pandemic and was one of the first to reach out to us. Britt discussed the challenges of the pandemic, layered with the challenges of transitioning between two labor commissioners. Commissioner Sherry Berry had in 2018 decided not to run for re-election in 2020. Her decision came long before coronavirus became common on the minds of everyone. And indeed, the individuals inside the office, alongside Commissioner Berry, were planning for a long and grand farewell tour. Well, here's what happened according to Britt.
In 2018, a year and a half before the 2020 election, Commissioner Berry announced that she was not going to run for re-election. So we knew that 19 and of course going into 20, that this was our swan song, and we were going to make it the absolute best. We were not going to waste a minute. There was not a mile she was not going to travel. There was not a group that she was not going to meet with. And we were, 19 being aware that 20 was going to be our last year, getting ready to go into 20. We were operating on all cylinders, ready to say goodbye, but also ready to just go out in a damn blaze of glory. The last year was just going to be how many places, she told us, she goes, there is nowhere I'm not going. There's nowhere I'm not going. There's nowhere I'm not driving. She felt it was her privilege to do that. So I was just so honored and excited to be a part of all that. And she was going to, like I say, she was going to go out in a blaze of glory. And as I'm sure we'll get into, that kind of was taken away from us.
And in several interviews, the issue of long COVID came up. Here's State Health Director and Chief Medical Officer Betsy Tilson discussing the sense of trauma that will linger on as part of our collective memory as a result of this pandemic.
And I think the level of trauma of the workforce, of myself personally, I think we are the tail of the trauma and the tail of the kind of behavioral health effects and the mental health effects of this. There's going to be a long time before we, recover from this. I think this has 100% been the hardest time of my personal and professional life. Just the intensity and the uncertainty and just the terror of it sometimes, the terror of the magnitude, saying, we're going to have to launch the biggest mass vaccination campaign ever done in history with like a month to prepare. And in the very beginning of the pandemic, we were kind of falling behind. And so then, people grant you about a day grace. And then like day 2, they're like, why is North Carolina so bad? Oof, the onslaught of the difficulty of the work and the lack of grace and the immediate just tearing into how you're not doing things well, and just, it'll take a long time, I think, for us as just a country and a society and a state and a workforce to, and a kind of family and personally for all of us to recover from this. We'll get there, but it'll need to be very intentional to realize what we all went through and are still going through. It's not over. What we're still going through has been truly unprecedented and will leave marks and scars, I think, for a long time, and we will be triggered. We won't realize why we trigger or respond to something so vehemently down the road, and we're gonna have to remember, oh, okay, it's all this kind of trauma that has a lasting scar, and so we're gonna have to be really mindful of this as we move forward, both professionally and personally, and intentionally work to heal through this.
Of course, there was a tremendous amount of loss that this pandemic brought and will continue to bring. But according to many of those we interviewed, there have been a few makeshift stopgaps and several long-term silver linings that have come out of an extremely dark cloud. Current Department of Health and Human Services Secretary Cody Kinsley discusses what he coins as a crisis-opportunity.
So I think one of the, I think there's some really great areas where we, I think, have moved forward, and I call it a crisis-opportunity. When you've got kind of clarity of mission, right? Everybody agrees, like, this is the thing we need to do, right? So kind of distractions, right? Like, so much of what government is trying to do so many things for so many people with really limited time and resources, right? And constantly trying to prioritize across all that work, right? I think everybody who is my experience, people who don't work in government assume government doesn't do things, and people who do work in government then learn, oh my gosh, there's like too much work to do. And that's because we're answerable to the public, we're answerable to a lot of people, and so there's a lot of different opinions about what needs to be done. But for at least, I would say, I don't know if it is still continuing at this moment, but for about 14 months, everybody agreed what we needed to do. And having that sense of like clarity and frankly, the authority that comes with that level of, mandate, if you will, is really powerful, because it allows the team, right, as a kind of a leader of teams that I've organized the way all of our operational work, right, getting folks on the same page about the priorities and the focus, right, like it all flowed from one thing, which was like saving lives. And so how do we use this moment to think about all the ways to do that and to do it as well as possible?
He goes on to highlight 3 key opportunities that have come out of this crisis. First, more collaboration across divisions within the department and more space for people to shine. Second, major improvements in the data infrastructure, collection of data, and use of data. And third, a redoubling to the commitment towards equity work in the healthcare field, especially with regard to historically marginalized communities. And that's where the next conversation comes into play. One of those crisis opportunities come to us from the former Deputy of Health and Human Services Secretary, Dr. Mandy Cohen. In her interview, she discusses many of the initiatives that were put together as a result of the crisis of this pandemic, including separate and competing hospital systems working together across the state, the creation of a vaccine platform that's robust and targeted, and the ability to gather data so that systems can be rebuilt to aid individuals in historically marginalized communities.
The thing I'm very proud of, and I hope stays well beyond me and beyond the Cooper administration, is this focus on equity and collecting race and ethnicity data. It is so, so important. Here's one example that I'm really proud of is like we created a COVID support program in 32 counties, I believe, out of 100, which means we didn't get everywhere, which is where I'd say we don't solve all the problems. We got to 32 counties, but we got to those 32 counties because they were the ones that were identified as historically marginalized communities, so more African American, Hispanic, Native American communities that were hardest hit by COVID and needed the most support. Now, not just a test, not just a vaccine, that was the minimum, but they needed wage replacement if they were sick with COVID. We needed to pay them to stay home, because if they're at home, that means they're not working their gig job, and they're not paying rent. Of course, they're not going to quarantine at home, like if they need to buy food for their family. But if there was a wage replacement program, we did. If there was food delivery, which we paid for, if there was free transportation to your doctor's visit or to your vaccine appointment, or to which we paid for, right? So it was also recognizing the full totality of what someone's health situation was, and that wasn't always just their COVID status. Health is about their economic health, their mental health, their spiritual health, the health of their communities. So we were able, but again, you can't do that unless you have the underlying data. Otherwise, you're just kind of shooting in the dark and you're hoping things make a difference. So that's why I put such an emphasis first on the data, and then on using that data to actually change the way you use your time and your resources. I mean, that's the whole ball game. And then build trust and communicate. So, that's what we systematically tried to do, even in a time of crisis, because it was more important too. And in fact, we let that crisis teach us about what we should be doing when we're not in crisis.
Something that all of our individuals mentioned was working from home. And indeed, I would say that this is something we can all hold in common. Each of our narrators touched on the issue in similar but distinctive ways. And an individual that we interviewed from the Department of Commerce mused about working from home in, I think, a quite fascinating way. This individual shared that his house was no longer his house, but on the second floor became NC State University, because that's where his daughter was taking classes virtually. In the home office, that became the County Taxation Bureau, as his wife did her job there, and his dining room transformed itself into the Department of Commerce, where he did his job remotely. While working from home worked for some, others hoped for a move towards something that resembles a hybrid approach. Deputy Secretary for the Office of Archives and History, Dr. Darren Waters, talks about what he hopes will change in the office after the pandemic is behind us. He hopes for a return to meetings in person, both formal and informal.
Because I think we'll always be in a hybrid space. I think that if we're in the office together, if people are in the office together, we'll go back to the conference room to meet, to sit in the meeting. I don't think that we'll sit on a screen. It just doesn't make any sense to me. People will have water cooler conversations again, right? I think that we'll do that again. You'll talk at the water cooler. Right now, everybody just stays away from each other. You walk past. Most buildings that you go into, the water fountains have been covered up. I mean, they've been kind of backed up. No one uses the water fountain. I think that you'll see people maybe in, like the coffee place, the coffee area, kind of standing there, maybe chatting with each other. Right now, people are not doing that. But mostly what I'm hoping that we won't do is that my office is right across from the other deputy secretary, is right across from the secretary's office. I hope that we won't sit in our offices and actually sit on the screen and meet. If we need to meet, we'll just either jump into each other's office or go down the hall to the conference room to meet.
So what I've presented here represents merely a small sampling of the stories that have been shared, and as we collect more, a greater number of perspectives will be revealed. Of course, everything has changed as a result of COVID-19, and one of the interesting and bonus insights that this project provided us is not from any one interview necessarily, but it's from the totality of the interviews. Taken as a whole, this collection highlights the changing attitude towards COVID over the months that this project is ongoing. What I mean by that, our interviewees from early in the project believed the pandemic would stretch on forever. Then in the summer, relief came to the voices of those interviewed, which gave way to a more pessimistic outlook as variants continued to appear. In the way they talk about things that we took for granted, like working in the office or meeting face to face, early interviews have a different tenor than those in the middle, and certainly from those completed more recently. It's an experience we all share, and these interviews seek to capture this evolving moment in history, because I think there will become a time when people don't remember what it's like to be on lockdown, or to have to cancel a vacation, or work from home for an indivisible but deadly prolonged natural disaster. And instead of letting the memories be forgotten or seen as a monolith, we aim to record it as people working for the state remember it while it's still happening. And I think Assistant Secretary at DHHS, at the Department of Health and Human Services, Mark Benton, said it best.
Other than just repeating to what I shared with you last night, that what an important project that you have embarked upon, and I have shared with my staff many times that that long after this pandemic is in our rearview mirror, there will be those who will come behind us and ask for data, whether it's death certificate data, whether it's these audio files or other documents, and give us an unvarnished sense of how well we did or did not do. But I hope that I do not live long enough to have another global pandemic that either impacts me or I have to be a part of the leadership. But it will eventually come around, and I really do believe that these conversations will help those that find themselves in some of the same seats of the folks that you have interviewed, and it will be sort of part of a lasting part of if we call it a legacy, but perhaps our gift to them, and what we learned from all of this and take away from all of this.
All right. So here in New York, we have responsibility for providing records management advice and issuing records retention schedules for both state agencies and local governments. We also identify, preserve, and make available archival state agency records. local governments are primarily responsible for preserving their own records. We've contacted key agencies that were involved in pandemic, and we've received a modest transfer of electronic records, including preservation and capture of agency websites. In preparing guidance for local governments and state agencies, we noticed that some of the federal retention requirements for pandemic-related programs differed from our own retention requirements, and we wanted to alert governments to that fact. So, for example, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, that act related to paid sick leave and expanded family and medical leave and applied to public employers, among other employers. And it was only for a set period of records. Those leave requests between April of 2020 and December of 2020. And federal requirements or federal regulations said that those records needed to be maintained for 4 years, which is 1 year longer than our existing retention requirements. In another case, the Higher Education Emergency Relief Fund, which includes the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan, with federal programs, normally the retention period for those records is 3 years from the date of submission of the final expenditure report. But the US Treasury, their requirement for these particular records was 5 years after final payment is made. Fortunately for us, most fiscal records need to be held for 6 years, according to our state comptroller's audit requirements. So we were okay in terms of retention requirements for that. We did work with the Department of Health on a couple of retention items. One that pretty much every government had were the health screening records. And we made this broad enough so that it could encompass records that might be created during another, hopefully not another pandemic. And the retention period we came up with was to destroy them 30 days after completion of the questionnaire. As part of this retention item, we advised governments not to collect health information or temperature readings because those types of records may make the records subject to OSHA, which would bring a 30-year plus retention period. Unfortunately, later we learned that our state information technology services office, who manages most of these records because they're in electronic format for agencies, they were not consulted as part of this project. So we've made a note that for the future, we need to make sure that they're in the loop on these retention decisions we make. We also worked with the Department of Health on the traveler health forms that they required out-of-state travelers complete at the beginning of the pandemic. And those were scheduled for destruction 2 years after creation. That would allow the health department to take any civil actions if need be. We also thought that there might be a promising set of records within the Division of Housing and Community Renewal. They were responsible for administering the state emergency rent relief program. However, we found that for a variety of different reasons, most of the records did not have long-term historical value. But we did think that the final report, which summarized the program, was something of historic value. pretty early on during the pandemic, we put information on our website that basically listed some of the general categories of records that we found over the years have archival value, and we highlighted those that would likely be applicable to pandemic documentation. So, for example, subject and correspondence records of the chief executive and senior leadership, or major administrative policies, plans, or studies that had to do with the pandemic. We identified about 20 key state agencies that were involved in the pandemic response, and we contacted those key agencies. First, the Director of Government Record Services sent emails to agency records management officers, and then members of my staff followed up and reached out directly to agency records management officers. We've received a modest transfer of electronic records so far. Most of the agencies that we talked to said, well, the pandemic's still going on and we still need those records, or we're still producing records. We're too busy right now, come back later. Or we heard from agencies that those records are already scheduled for transfer as part of an existing record series. So for example, commissioner records, and we're going to receive those at a future date. Or in a lot of cases, the records were available on the agency's website or social media. We heard from agencies that they had some potential privacy or legal concerns about transferring such records to us. But we did get direct transfer of records, of electronic records, from a few agencies. And here's examples of those. So our Office of Mental Health administered a federal program called Project Hope Crisis Counseling Program. And we received the final reports related to that program, which summarize basically the services that they provided to people in crisis. We also received policy-related records from the Office of Children and Family Services, and those records were directed to staff and those under their jurisdiction for handling day-to-day and special responsibilities, including protocols for social distancing. And finally, we received records from the State Education Department. These were weekly reports that were created over a 6-month period at the beginning of the pandemic, and basically summarized the activities of various program units. And these reports were presented to the Board of Regents. And then finally, we received through indirect transfer archival agency websites, which Bonnie's going to talk about.
Hey, thanks, Jennifer. We began capturing state government websites in December 2006, and since 2017, we've used Archivist to do so. The novel coronavirus emerged as a global concern as we were about 2/3 of the way through a comprehensive effort to capture the more than 300 websites maintained by New York State's legislature, unified court system, and the governor and executive branch agencies. And as a result, this crawl picked up sites maintained by the Department of Health and several other entities that captured press releases, policy statements, health guidance, and other information about the state's response to the pandemic during its early phases. Since that time, we've conducted numerous supplemental crawls that have focused on sites maintained by the Department of Health and other entities dealing with the medical aspects of the pandemic, and on sites maintained by the Department of Education, the Department of Labor, Office of Children and Family Services, and other entities grappling with its social and economic effects. However, today I'm going to talk about how we dealt with one site that contained a large quantity of pandemic-related information, but which was for the most part uncrawlable and which became an urgent priority for reasons not related to COVID-19. Next slide, please. Most of the information contained within the official website of New York's governor, governor.ny.gov, is presented dynamically. This includes press releases, which are frequently consulted by agencies, political scientists, journalists, and other researchers, the public schedules of the governor and the lieutenant governor, information about programs and initiatives of particular importance to the governor, and copies of executive orders and legislation championed by the governor's office. It should be said that the executive orders and legislation are readily available via other sites. They're not the record copies. They're purely there for informational purposes, but researchers do appreciate having all of this information in one place. Unfortunately, neither Archivist's Heritrix crawler nor its new beta Browser crawler can capture more than a handful of each of these files. Slide, please. Just to give you an example, the image at the top of the screen is a screenshot of the press releases page of the live governor.ny.gov site that I took on last Thursday. Note the individual releases and the search features at the left. And at the bottom, you see a screenshot from our August 22nd, 2021 capture of the governor's press release page, which doesn't capture any of the information that should have occupied the space between the news banner and the links that appear at the bottom of each page of the site. Our inability to capture most of the information found on the governor's site was a longstanding problem. However, it became something of a crisis last summer when a series of scandals prompted Governor Andrew Cuomo to announce on August 10th that he was resigning effective August 24th. On August 11th, a member of the governor's digital team reached out to the archives about how best to preserve the information contained within the governor's site. The team recognized its value and wanted to make sure that the information it contained would remain accessible to the public. At the same time, it needed to remove from the governor.ny.gov site most of the information relating to Governor Cuomo and launch a revamped version of the site when Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul took office, became governor on August 24th. Slide, please. After we explained why we were unable to capture most of the information on the governor.ny.gov site, the governor's digital team and the State Office of Information Technology Services, which maintains the governor's site, decided to build a new crawler-friendly version of the site. Doing so would enable ITS to remove most of the information relating to Governor Cuomo from the live site and allowing the archives to capture the information by crawling a new site with a different domain. The crawler-friendly version of the site contained a new Archives navigational tab that afforded access to the press releases, executive orders, program files, and schedule items. Owing to a technical quirk, the legislation files could not be incorporated into this version of the site, and ITS transferred them to us separately. The image at the top is the site's homepage, and the one at the bottom is of the first page of press releases. Owing to the sheer size of this site, it contained over 14,000 press releases and 8,400 schedule items. We ended up running numerous test crawls and consulted extensively with Archivist support about scoping and other issues. On September 24th, we set into motion a crawl that finished on October 11th and captured almost 39 gigabytes of data. In the days that followed, we ran a few tightly focused supplemental crawls that picked up about 6 weeks worth of English language releases that were not included in that September 24th crawl. Despite our best efforts, we were not able to capture about 6 weeks worth of foreign language translations of press releases before the site was decommissioned on October 29th. However, we do have copies of the missing translation and all of the other files that comprise the site. On September 24th, a member of the governor's digital team brought a hard drive containing 2 sets of files to the archives. The first, the media files, consisted of all the press releases, schedules, program files, executive orders, and legislation files that were made available via the governor's site. And the second set consisted of all of these files, plus all of the structural, formatting, and other files needed to reconstruct the capture-friendly version of the governor's website. We're still determining precisely what we're going to do with all of these files, many of which are also duplicated in the roughly 1,000 cubic feet of paper records that the Office of the Governor transferred to us several weeks later. But we've ingested the digital files into Preservica for safekeeping. As a result of the impromptu collaboration between the governor's team, the State Office of Information Technology Services, And the archives, and with the assistance of Archivist support, the archives now has electronic copies of over 500 Office of the Governor press releases, documenting on a near daily basis the state's response to the spread of COVID-19, and easy to access reference copies of more than 100 executive orders issued as a result of the pandemic, as well as copies of legislation intended to ameliorate its social and economic impact. In addition, we have good cause to expect that the records documenting the state's pandemic response under Governor Kathy Hochul will eventually come our way. Everyone who is involved in the effort to ensure the preservation of Governor Cuomo's web presence came away convinced that it would be best to begin planning for the future well before future gubernatorial transitions take place.
All right. Well, now for Kentucky's response to COVID-19, which is actually it's got a lot of similarities with New York's. So that was interesting to hear. The Kentucky Department for Libraries and Archives and Records Management Division, that's a mouthful, houses the Commonwealth's permanent public records in the State Archive Center and the Kentucky State Digital Archives, and non-permanent records in our State Record Center. We preserve and provide access to historic and administrative records for use by Kentucky's public agencies and researchers worldwide. To set the stage a little bit about our reaction, I need to first touch on how we operated before. Prior to the pandemic, our unit, the Electronic Records Branch, provides advice and technical support, training and guidance to state and local government agencies on all archives and records management related matters. This includes records transfer to the archives, as well as in-agency records management and preservation guidance. We also offer guidance on digitization, which is a very popular subject locally in state and local offices, on-site preservation, and organizational best practices. So when the pandemic hit, we faced many challenges, many of the same as other states. Kentucky had a truly admirable response in figuring out the logistics of moving to primarily a telecommuting work model throughout all state government, other than the few essential people that had to be in their offices there in late 2020. The Commonwealth Office of Technology, which is our centralized IT, worked directly with agencies, including us, to set up not one, but multiple VPN options and assigned internet hotspots to staff whose homes were in rural areas or anyone lacking sufficient internet speed and bandwidth. New records of administrative and historical import were then being generated very quickly during that time. Speeches, executive orders, official correspondence, press releases, and more. Though our records management guidance tends to direct records to the archives, the rapidity of the records creation, coupled with records transfer being far from the minds of agency personnel at the time, we at the archives had become much more proactive in our collection practices. And as mentioned, we provide guidance to state and local agencies on in-office electronic records management preservation. And when the entire focus of this shifted to a home office environment, we began getting very specific records management questions and even requests for trainings from some of the largest bodies in state government. So, as I mentioned, we had to address rapid records generation of, if not new records, then a lot more of known records than we are used to. And we take in records electronically in sort of a slow trickle, and the jury is still out a little bit on the best method to get these with. Like New York, I don't want to wait until the next gubernatorial transition. So we are still figuring out the best method for getting them. We also have important policy changes, and many changes have been made to the operations of pretty much all the state agencies, and many of them are likely to stick around in some form or fashion after the pandemic ends, or whatever the outcome might be. Several of these changes, like a hybrid work from home model, were not considered prior to COVID, but we've now seen the benefits firsthand, and they are well proven now. The work from home and virtual or hybrid meetings will continue to have a place in government. There's also records management concerns in the home and office environment, and it's not just a change of scenery, but a drastic change in how people are storing and accessing their records. So much like New York in their presentation, one of our greatest tools for collecting COVID-19 related records so far has been our partnership with Archivist and our web archiving program. As soon as it became clear in 2020 that the pandemic was serious business and might stick around, we began to look at our web archiving practices and adjusting the frequency of the scheduled crawls, as well as the seeds that were in place and what needed to be added. The governor's office and the Cabinet for Health and Family Services created a COVID web portal at kycovid19.ky.gov. And from the beginning, the site displayed the incidence rate or number of infected, the geographical models for the infections, steps to combat the virus as they were becoming discovered. And many of these came through in executive orders early on, and then guidance documents, including infographics and videos on the best known prevention practices. Like some other states, our governor began doing daily COVID-19 updates. These were simulcast on television and to social media. It was largely confined to Facebook and YouTube, where these streamed. And we focused on the Facebook feed since it was easier to crawl and capture than YouTube due to some site security and encoding settings. And happy to say that we've captured nearly 500 of these videos. A few of the more recent ones, I think something happened with our crawl, which I need to assess and rerun it. Thankfully, those videos are still up there to be recorded, but we have most of them so far. And these went from daily reports to less frequent. In fact, they stopped for a while, but now I believe we are back to weekly reports with Omicron and the positivity rates still being high. We've mostly been focused on the capture, but we're about to embark on a project to describe and even harvest some of the records that we may or may not get through transfers. I'm bringing in one person to give our metadata an overhaul and monitor the crawls a little closer. And then another staff person will focus on harvesting documents and an ingest into Preservica. So we are going to get on that soon. The good thing is we do have them, and we are crawling our COVID-19 hub in Kentucky on a weekly basis. So while it's not daily data, we will have quite a snapshot from March of 2020 to now. So that should be of great use to future researchers in medicine or history. So to a lesser extent, we have been doing a little more specific email archiving, though we still don't have a fully functioning email archiving program, which is definitely it's probably going to be the hill I'm going to die on when it comes to, it's kind of my passion project. So we are trying to get that going, but we also collected all kinds of guidance in the form of press releases from the governor's office, the personnel cabinet, and our own cabinet, the education and workforce development cabinet. Before the end of this administration, we will be specifically requesting this of leadership from agencies across state government, the actual emails, the official correspondence, because many will reflect the same top-down guidance, but also show the administrative history of these agencies through cabinet and agency-specific policy changes. Another thing was a large outcry for training and guidance when it came to records management in the office, at home, wherever they might be. The primary concerns with records management trainings were creating and managing public records at home and maintaining adequate management of correspondence. And we did a series of 6 email management centered trainings for the finance cabinet, which is a truly large body in state government. It includes the Commonwealth Office of Technology I spoke about, the Department of Revenue and Facilities, which owns and maintains most state office buildings, focusing on an audience of leadership and management at first. The trainings grew in interest, and at the end, we reached over 170 officials just from that cabinet. There is already a trend for born digital replacing paper records throughout state government, and this has only increased in the last couple of years. And many agencies, forms that were traditionally accepted on paper have moved to digital, and with that came the need for internal electronic records management in these offices. We have had an incredible increase in virtual meetings with local offices on the city and county level to discuss the prerequisite levels of preservation that need to be considered. And that includes media and file migration, geographically diverse storage areas, and file standardization. We also covered security and access topics like role-based access, file organization, and naming conventions. So, lessons learned. We are still learning them. One is that we didn't have to do a thing. People came to us. Truly, the continued training and development, professional development is absolutely critical. It's not just convenient because we're a captive audience, stuck at home or in a half-empty office, on Zoom all day, but it's absolutely critical in these times because as the situation changes, the guidance must as well. And we've got questions about storage, about security matters, and luckily we were able to step up and help a number of largely state, but some local bodies. Communication and investment by management, IT, and project staff is key. We could not have gotten very far in being able to maintain our work and not just continue it, but excel at it. So hopefully that can continue as we ease out of the pandemic, whenever that might be. Also, working from home exposed technology gaps, and we as a state have mostly addressed them when it came to some staff having laptops, some not having reliable internet. It's brought everybody into a place where we can get the job done regardless of where we are, which is, even after the pandemic, will be a real boon to progress. And then, not listed here, but it's a lesson we learned probably pre-pandemic, but it's only been strengthened now for records transfers. Early initiation is everything. I know New York has done an amazing job, it sounds like, being in touch and receiving records already. And so I believe that communication with records creators is key, and we will be pursuing that a little harder this year. So it's not a great way to end this because we're still in it, but not done yet. We're looking at a major transfer from state agencies. Many of them who have been there a while may not be aware that we, the extent of everything we want that is COVID related. So we're going to push on that very soon. AV media, it goes with curation and versus complete processing. When we're dealing with 500 videos of an hour length, do we want to put all of those in expensive Preservica storage? Do we want to, the answer is probably yes, but do we want to keep them on our server and only put out a curated collection that spans the whole time? So that is something we are still going to be figuring out about sharing such a vast collection with the populace. And then metadata and processing. It's still going to take some time to clean up not just our Archivist collection, but if we're going to harvest these or receive them in a on a hard drive or via transfer, it takes time to process media files of any type, and that is the largest concern. The others are easier to manage, but AV stuff can take, as most of you know, can take a little longer. So that is where we're done. That is where we are. And with that, I will turn it back over to Jamie.
All right. Thanks, everyone. There was so much good information there. We are, let's see, just getting to my last slides here. I suppose if anybody wants to stay on and ask questions, you are more than welcome to. But we also were scheduled to go until 3. So thank you, everybody, for attending. Thanks to our presenters. Please stay connected with COSA, and there will be a quick survey at the end. We would appreciate your feedback. So thank you, everyone. I guess if anybody, or I'm speaking for the panelists, if you would like to stay on and answer any questions, you're more than welcome to, or head out if you all need to. I'm taking a look at chat to see if there's any questions. I'm sure everybody could have filled the whole hour, so there's lots more that could have been said.
I actually had a question for North Carolina. And apologies if you said this in your presentation, but do you have a repository where you're going to store and provide access to your oral histories? Is it integrated with the software, or I don't know if I missed that part or if it wasn't discussed.
It wasn't discussed, Eric. Yeah, they're all going into our normal archive repository. We're not going to have them online at the moment. That might be something for the future, but they are going to be listed in the catalog. So they will be searchable, and if anybody wants to come into the archive and listen to them, that they can do. So we are treating them as we would any other sort of archival record, as sort of an agency record, because they're all at the moment they're all employees of the agency, except for the 2 register of deeds that we spoke to, and we archive those by the county, so they'll be sort of filed by the county, but they will all just go into the sort of the archival filing system. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm not seeing any other questions, so we can wrap it up. Thank you so much, everybody. It was really great.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.